Is this working? Can you be a bit higher? That's good. Okay. There's been a long history of artists and scientists and makers and designers collaborating together. But actually, came to realise that during the 19th century, that came to a sort of something of an abrupt halt, mainly because of photography. And because photography put the kind of imaging in the hands of the scientist, those collaborations, the need that the scientists have for artists to kind of visualize, sort of went out of the window. And as the technologies became more expensive, more complex, it kind of went into those collaborations went into decline until the last 20 years, really, as digital technologies came on stream and places like the Wellcome pushing the idea of the importance for collaboration and communication. So things changed quite a lot. Edward and I share a similar background in that we both studied ceramics at the Central School of Art a long time ago. And I'm not quite sure how Ed got to study ceramics. For me, it was one of those spur-of-the-moment chance decisions on foundation when I wasn't quite sure whether I was going to do painting or sculpture. And clay seemed like an interesting option. So I studied ceramics, but I realized I was never a mud and water man. And after I graduated, I started kind of moving outside of ceramics. But I quickly became aware of attitudes that came with that. You mentioned, within the kind of art world, you mentioned the fact that I kind of studied a craft subject. And at that time, it was really, it was taboo, really. It was, it was really kind of looked down on. And slowly you kind of work kind of through that. And then I gradually came to realize also that I might not have been a mud and water man, but actually ceramics gave me some really good insights into kind of cultural artifacts and their place within society, how they reflected contemporary issues, discoveries, and their place within kind of the wider arts. And I think the same was true of graphic works. The word illustration has been kind of used as a dirty word. I mean, I've kind of seen that in reviews. And that kind of troubles me because I think it gets in the way and it creates kind of false hierarchies. So what I want to do tonight, I want to show kind of a variety of different projects I've done. And I'm just going to lead in with one or two examples which show a kind of lineage through from the past to today. It's not a very good slide. It was taken on my phone recently. It's the kind of Lady and the Unicorn, which I was very familiar with from kind of LP sleeves from the 60s. And I was in Paris recently, and it's in the Cluny Museum, Museum of the Middle Ages. And it's it's a cycle of 7 tapestries. And it is stunning. It is absolutely kind of stunning. And each one is dedicated to a different sense. And when I was looking at it, I started to kind of see it in a slightly different light, the way that it's using space. And I started to see it in relation to the way space is extended beyond the kind of plane, so that you don't just see it as a tapestry hanging on a wall. It's extending that space beyond the rooms that they were kind of housed in. And then looking more closely, the quality, it's a very early digital form of art. It's a pixelated, it's one point at a time. And the skills that kind of used to really modulate the kind of color and tone across that surface are just fantastic, really. And it's very alive, and it breathes in a way that sometimes paint doesn't breathe. And I just wanted to show something which you may not have seen, but this is from the 50s and 60s. It's a kind of very minor French artist, Jean Leursa, sort of Picasso-esque. His paintings were okay, but he really rediscovered the tapestry industry in France, in Aubusson, and reinvigorated that. And this is a cycle, Le Champ du Monde, which was, if you're ever in Angers, you should really go and see it. It's a kind of monumental work, very decorative. This is a kind of champagne bottle. It's post-war. It's kind of very optimistic. But it's also, this is at the same time it's kind of considering Hiroshima. So it's kind of tying kind of these themes of life and death in this cycle of within the tapestry. And corpses, I mean, there's a bit of a corpse on the right, really. I mean, I suppose I had to put that in, but it's acceptable when an artist uses it. But it's really got an intensity which lasts. And it has a quality which is transformed through the process, I think. This is one of my favourite kind of little paintings of all time. It's kind of painted by Dürer, the great piece of turf. And what he was saying about the imitation of nature really displaying the artisan's knowledge of nature, constituting a kind of knowledge. And really he was looking at the way that imitating nature provides a knowledge, and it was a really strong kind of lead at that time. And it's about observing in accurate detail. He talked about the artist and the artisan containing scientia, the kind of knowledge which is held within what you look at. And this is Bernard Palissy. I haven't got the date on that. I think it's about 50 years later. And Palissy was a very famous potter working in Paris where the Tuileries are now. And he was, again, this kind of adherence to nature, trying to replicate nature. He developed a process whereby he could make life casts and work into the ceramics. And these pieces were considered really they were very high value pieces at their time. It's a process which, these are not life casts, this is modelled, but this is a piece from Lisbon, from the City Museum by Joana Vasconcelos from a couple of years ago. Done with a kind of factory, Bordalo Pinheiro, which continues that kind of tradition for a long time of working with kind of highly modelled, colourful animals. There are hundreds of different examples of different people. I just wanted to pick out this one. This is Wenzel Jamnitzer, who was a goldsmith, and he was more than just a goldsmith. He developed scientific instruments. He wrote a whole book on perspective. So this is an example of one of the pages from the book, looking at perspective, looking at construction, looking at form within the natural world and how it evolves. But also, he was making things like this, which, if one goes around the V&A, you tend to kind of scoot past pretty quickly in some ways, because they're very hard to take in. They're very curious objects. This is a sort of table centerpiece. But what it's made up of are life casts. This is 1540 again. These are ceramic casts, really, ceramic shell casting in gold and silver of plant material. And so that's what you could see in the background in that vase, in that painting. And in a way, looking at this is a photograph from the museum, so they've been laid out quite formally, but it did make me think of Karl Blossfeldt's work, his photographs in the 1920s. And again, Blossfeldt was a professor of applied design in Berlin, and he was taking these photographs for his own interest and as kind of teaching aids for the decorative art students that were working in metal. But there's a direct lineage through to kind of new objectivity within kind of German photography from that. This is another interesting character. This is Arthur Harry Church. He was a professor he was the keeper of botany at the Botanic Garden in Oxford. And he did a whole series of works. He was looking at the kind of sexuality of flowers and pollination. Kind of stunning illustrations, which kind of made me kind of look at Georgia O'Keeffe's in a different way, and of Judy Chicago's Dinner Party, which was kind of, I don't know if people are aware of this now, but this was a very, do people know this? Does anyone know this piece of work? Yeah, you should do. It was a kind of early feminist kind of work, which was, I'm seeing it in the early 80s when it was shown in London. But again, looking at that kind of sexuality within the kind of form, within these ceramic pieces. And again, within drawing, this is a head by Leonardo. This is a drawing by Santiago Cajal, actually that's how you pronounce it, who was a neuroscientist, Nobel Prize winner. And this is one of his drawings. He wanted to be an artist. There are quite a few people that want to be artists, but the parents don't let them. It's very familiar kind of territory. But he was one of those kind of very special scientists that was a phenomenal recorder and illustrator and draftsperson of what they were looking at. So looking at neural cells. But the drawings are, if I put that up, you could think of that in relation to David Smith's drawings or Jackson Pollock's drawings kind of from the 50s, the kind of expression that's in there. And I think it's quite nice to see it in relation to this by Henri Michaud. This is one of his drawings done under the influence of mescaline. So it's kind of playing around with the kind of the neurons in his brain. And this woodcut from 1772. They're very kind of elegant. For me, there's something very interesting about the constraints that one has if you're trying to show something very specific, but how inventive you are as the artist doing that drawing and putting those pieces together, that the elements of the information, visual and kind of textual. And this is a piece by Catherine Dawson, which was an MRI scan etched into glass from 10 years ago of her sister's brain. With tumour. So, leading to my work, this is a woodcut from 1568, which I bought in Parma last year. Just saw it in a sort of second-hand bookshop, and it's Pietro Mattioli, and it's a book, Medico Senesi. It was based on a medical work by Dioscorides, from 1500 years earlier, which was looking at medicinal plants. Mattioli was trying to kind of depict them much clearer and give better information. But it's a very beautiful, elegant print, and it's, I was just very pleased to find it. Also because it's a plant that I've worked with. So Ampeloprasum is it's a wild leek. So there's a wild leek in flower, and later dried. So you can see the seed heads with the black seeds in there. Those are the seeds. And if you kind of zoom in, that's the surface of those seeds. So the seed coat is elasticated. It grows structurally with these plates so that they can kind of move as the seed grows and contracts as it dries. There's a really good science writer, Philip Ball, who writes very clearly and concisely about scientific discoveries and principles, contemporary. And if you ever get a chance to hear him talk, he's very inspiring in a way. Anyway, he made just one comment about Leonardo having to sit for hours to see more sharply, but to transcend the limitations of his own eyes. And in a sense, that's something that I do. So, trying to reveal a little bit about how I work. I'm fortunate, I'm based in London and in Greece. My wife's Greek, so this is outside my studio in Greece. It's kind of surrounded by wild orchids in spring. And I can work from those. So I'm drawing. And that drawing that I'm doing, it's very direct drawing. It's a process I found worked some years ago. And I'm using coloured dye mixed in with Indian ink. And I'm just painting very directly and leaving it to soak into the paper. And then washing it off so that the dye, some of the ink stays and some of the dye stains into the paper. And I also photograph a lot. And that's also another kind of form of looking, another kind of lens. This is a butterfly orchid. And if we look closer into that, you see the kind of collaborators that the insect needs for, the flower needs for pollination. And if you start to go deeper in and in. So this is the surface of the petal. So these are what are called trichome hairs on the surface of the petal. And they're navigational aids for insects that are moving through. And they know that because there are hybrid plants which they developed, and they found that through the hybridization, the hairs changed, and they were less successful in terms of the pollination. And if we cut the stem in half, that's what we start to see. So those are the kind of cells running through the plant, through the stem. So this is an anemone, again outside the studio. That's one of the drawings. And that's an image of one of the stamens from that flower and a grain of pollen blown up from those little dots at the bottom. And I'm going to tell you about how those are done. But this is just to start this off, this is an image by Robert Hooke, the Micrographia. It's the 350th anniversary of the book this year. It's quite a sensational book. It was really the kind of first definitive book on microscopic images looking at insects, beetles, flies' eyes. But this particular page was of interest to me because what it's doing here is showing the same material at different orders of magnification. So this is cork, looking at the structure of the cork, which he described as looking like monastic cells, which is where the word cell comes from. Then you have the frond of the kind of leaves on the right-hand side. And how I got into this around about the end of the 90s, prior to all this work, I've been doing a lot of work which kind of looked culturally at how plants are appropriated in products, in history, in art. And I'd come to a kind of an end. And I had a microscope as a child, which I still have, a beautiful brass microscope. And it was the kind of best present my father ever gave me, really. A 10-year-old microscope. It's fantastic. So I felt there were opportunities to work with microscopic images which didn't seem to be, I didn't see them anywhere in any contemporary sense. So I wrote into all the heads in the labs at Kew and just got one reply. It was a magic bullet, really. And it was from Madeline Harley, who was the head of pollen research at that point. And she had an earlier career in interior design. And she had wanted to do exhibitions of her images of pollen. And at that time, Kew felt, first of all, you haven't got time, research is more important. And anyway, they're images of science, so that's not very interesting to the public. So attitudes kind of like that are also, go across and transcend boundaries. Each of these territories has their own kind of little hang-ups, if you like. And they were wrong. So we started working together. And the image on the right is one of the first images I did, and it's a pollen grain from the flower on the left, the plantain, and it's taken on a scanning electron microscope. And an electron microscope is you take a specimen, you coat it with a fine layer of gold, and then you put it in a chamber, and you bombard it with electron particles, which bounce off onto a sensor and give phenomenal kind of resolution. So that's magnified about, well, the original is about 2,000 times, so that's probably it's about 20,000 times by the time it gets up there. And what's interesting is that the image is black and white. I've coloured it, and I'll talk more about that in a moment. But also, there are differences and there are similarities. So Madeline would talk about sculpted surfaces and ornamental features as part of her botanical language, which I found interesting. But she wouldn't normally use a specimen like that in her work because it's collapsed. So you want to show the perfect specimen. So she would make sure they're washed and dried so they're fully inflated. But by putting these together, in a way, I was using that as a device like the hook kind of drawings. So you've got the flower, and then you've got the pollen grain alongside it. Is this one? What is that?
Yeah.
Oh, was it you? It's not open, no. Right, okay, sorry. I'll buy you one again. Each time you put something in a microscope, it's a world of discovery. And around this time, there were two exhibitions which were turned out to be very formative for me. The one was Flora Danica, and it was up at Inverleith House, Botanic Gardens in Edinburgh. And the Flora Danica is an 1800-piece dinner service, each piece hand-decorated with a botanical specimen from a botanical book of the same name, produced in Denmark. And they produced, I think, about 8 copies of this book. And the importance of those books were they were to give to people of authority in power in countries that Denmark wanted to impress. So it's the value of that kind of book as a trading object, if you like. But they're kind of stunningly, both the illustrations and the ceramic pieces are kind of very beautiful. And on the right, the frog surface, which Josiah Wedgwood was commissioned to make for Catherine the Great of Russia. And she wanted a dinner service decorated with images of English landscape. So the formal kind of French gardens were out, and English naturalism was in. And Wedgwood was, again, a really interesting character in that he was a scientist, he was a chemist, he was politically motivated in terms of the anti-slavery movement. He was a big mover in terms of developing canals so they could ship his... When they built the canal from the factory to other parts of the UK, his loss rate in terms of breakages dropped by 70%. So it was in his interest to kind of make the canals work. And he employed various artists to do drawings of sites of specific interest around the UK, anything from Fingal's Cave to stately homes. And those were done as engravings, which were put onto the dinner service. But before he sent it out to Russia, he did a show. He hired a venue in Regent Street, and he showed them there, so he could take more orders from the people whose stately homes he depicted. So he was very influential as an entrepreneur as well as a potter. So these two things kind of struck me. And it was at a time when I saw an advert for new projects in Grisdale Forest. And I'd been through Grisdale the year before, and I'd found it really disappointing. I mean, I think it had about 15 years, and the earlier kind of work, Goldsworthy and David Nash, sort of more pioneering kind of forest-making work and in the landscape, had sort of moved on to a very kind of a pastiche of that, I felt. So I proposed a different idea, and it just happened that it landed on the desk the same day as Adam Sutherland, the kind of current director, had just started. And he was more open to other ideas. So I said I would develop a dinner service based on pollen grains I would collect from the flowers in the forest. So that's me being a kind of scientist, playing with daffodils, overlooking Lake Coniston, and then doing drawings. And I developed a series. It was I think only about 120 pieces. I couldn't manage the 800. But each place setting, there were 12 place settings, and each one was based on a different flower. And they were printed up in colour and with gold. So they were very simply luxurious, if you like. At the top there's a little bit of text, and the text came from a manuscript of John Ruskin's when he was talking about the flowers in the wayside in his early childhood. And Ruskin's house was just underneath the location where I was working, and I got access to his archives. Clearly it's not a piece to be left out in the forest, so we did this kind of meal. So the drawings that I was doing became prints onto the napkins. And it's a bit of a high-risk venture in middle of September in the Lake District. And it had rained for 2 weeks solidly while I was up there setting this up. But it stopped for one day. And the people invited, I knew one or two of them, but not many. And I only invited people who had an association with the project. So there was a beekeeper, local beekeeper. There was a herbalist. There was the gardener from Ruskin's house. And everyone had to bring something to contribute to that. There was a woman who's a food historian, jeweler, and venison farmer, and she developed the menu for the meal. And all the food came from the forest. So 2 types of venison, Arctic char, herbs, and it was this kind of 4-hour meal out on top of the fells. And had Robert Wolfe, who was the director of the Wordsworth Trust, and he gave readings of kind of Wordsworth's, some of Wordsworth's poetry. And it was just using the plates in a very functional way as a conduit to bring people together for a brief moment in time. And one of the people I'd invited was the then Ruskin scholar at Oxford, who I'd never met. And it turned out he was an advisor to Nesta, National Endowment for Science, Technology and the Arts. And he, as a gift to him helping them, they said, can you propose 2 people for a fellowship? And I was saying to Ed earlier, I'm very bad at applying for funding, but I've been quite lucky in people dropping things in my lap from time to time. So I was really given 3 years funding to continue the work at Kew. And it meant I could immerse myself quite deeply in learning the languages of the science and what I might do with it. And these are images of pollen and seeds. This is a marigold seed. And what I was keen to do was, I didn't want to use the kind of the scientists' kind of goodies from their cookie jars. I wanted to do all my own work, all my own lab work, and that's quite demanding, both scientifically and in terms of time. And I wanted to try and meet them halfway would be kind of arrogant in a way, but part of the way so I could learn some of their knowledges. And you learn a lot. I mean, this is a balloon seed. So interestingly, I showed this, well, I didn't show it, no, someone else showed this image at a day conference at the V&A last year, and it was a day on biomimicry, and an architect got up and showed it, and he was talking about function within plants. And he said, and this is very clearly for protection. And I was talking after him. So I said, well, actually, it's not. That's not what it's for. And I suppose if I looked at it, I would make the same assumption as he did in a way. It looks like a packing to protect the embryo seed, which is the green part you can see inside. But actually, it's to give it a bigger wind profile for minimum weight, so it will blow further on the wind. And it's almost like a kind of 3D printed object. Those lines you can see within the kind of, those chambers, those are layers of cellulose which build up. It's white willow. And that is from scabious, from the Greek mountains. Now, when I started working, as I said, the colour was black and white, the image is black and white. And I started adding colour, and you could ask questions like, oh, is that the original colour? So the answer is no. So people say, oh, so it's false colour. And false colour is a term that scientists will use to describe coloration that they give to their images. And it's done through programs. It's a lot of push-button technology. And I found it got more and more irritating in a way, because there's a lot of work to do this. It's not just push-button technology, and it's very different. If you see the images that are say in the window of the welcome round the corner, it's different to their images, and it's because they're very subtly worked. So all the kind of the skills I have from painting and from drawing, I developed through the colour I apply to this, and it's done very simply through Photoshop. but it's lots and lots of layers and hours, bringing out a variety of different things. So I'll use colour based on the original flower, and I'll use the colour to also work on different structural and functional characteristics of the specimen, and also go with what I think is the character of the specimen. So this is a very kind of Izmaelki, kind of balletic piece. It's almost like compressed silk. I also came to realize that, I think to begin with I was afraid of being accused of manipulating the scientific material. But then I realized that that's exactly what the scientists do. They kind of wash and prepare their specimens to show what it is that they want to show. And that's what I'm doing. So this is also outside my studio. So this is an ant in full armor. And that's a kind of ant refuse tip, if you like, of seeds. And that's one of the seeds. It's a medicargo, medic. Very simple, kind of very commonplace plant. And that's the seed prior to get, so that's been coated with platinum. And this should run through how I... It's a kind of, this is what I prepared earlier. And these I print up as large format images, so that they're very intense and very powerful in a way to kind of draw you in. What's interesting, kind of, as you start to work within that, you start to work as a botanist, you look through kind of families. And the medicargo, I think there are 34 different species within that family, and they each have similar characteristics, so they're all kind of spiral. Some are spiky, some are not. Mine is quite big, it's about the size of a 5p piece, really. These images have been reproduced extensively around the world. I mean, one of the things I did through the Nesta Fellowship, my manager challenged me, he'd heard me talking about doing a book, and so he challenged me to get a book deal together. So I'd always done artist books in the past. So I put something together, and I went with Madeleine cold calling around the London Book Fair. And all Thames and Hudson Fine, they kind of loved the work, but they didn't know where to put it in the bookshop. They didn't know what the audience was. And I finally found a small publisher that had worked with many books on architecture. And they said, well, we'll give it a go. You won't sell very many, and it won't be very big. And as we started working on it, it grew. And so we did one book on pollen, we did one on seeds, and one on fruit, and then another one. And I think we've sold now about 150,000 copies in 8 languages. And we always felt that the images had a lot of potential for different audiences, whether it was beekeepers or architects. I know Thomas Heatherwick used it quite a lot when he was developing the Sea Cathedral for the Shanghai Expo that he did, and he worked with the botanists that I worked with, and jewelers. And I suppose, as I was influenced as a kind of student by the Karl Blossfeldt books, I wanted to try and do a book that would kind of do the same thing for this generation. And that's really kind of gratifying. And so those are my dispersal mechanisms. The plants have their own, whether they're wind-borne or insect-borne. When I was doing the Ruskin work, one of the books I had access to in the Ruskin library was his book of pressed flowers, which he collected from Chamonix. And the kind of Victorian kind of classic tour of going, across the Alps to Venice, and is something that I do nearly every year. So I drive down in a different kind of carriage, and I collect specimens en route, but I collect them in the filter of the car. So this is the kind of lazy botanist guide to flowers of the Alps. So these are pollen grains from the filter of the car. And some of them I can identify, and that is quite clearly pine. It couldn't be anything else. They're always that kind of shape. And that's also a kind of dandelion family. And that's also mallow family. Could be pea, could be... So sometimes you can be more specific than others. And I don't know what that is, but that's okay. And I used these for a project I was invited to take part in at Botanic Gardens in Oxford, and it was a 3-evening event. It was a sound event. And I did a piece in relation to this tree, the Davidia, which is also known as the handkerchief tree. And these white bracts, these kind of petals hanging down, give me the idea to kind of, I'll use these as prints onto handkerchiefs. So the idea of aeroallergens and kind of hay fever and silk. So I hung those in the tree. And then, when I was in Greece, a good friend who has about 50 beehives. So I went out with them when they were collecting honey. And it was interesting, it hadn't occurred to me until they kind of pulled the frame out with the bees in, that was another collection device. It was very similar to the kind of filter from the car. So I brought back a new beehive, which became used to house the speaker. So that was going through the evening, and that was what kind of drew people to it. So I'm interested in how you meet audiences. I mean, I don't do many gallery white cube shows. I tend to do things out in kind of landscape or other venues like this. So this is a way of using the sound of those bees to draw the people into that work, which we could then talk about. I just got that as an email today, actually, from a gallery that's showing this piece. I don't have to say whose work it is, but this is, I find, actually more interesting. Now, this is a lepidochrome. Now, I'd never heard of a lepidochrome. It was from a book. It's slightly macabre in that it was a book of actual butterflies, and the guy developed, Horace Waller, developed the process whereby he would print a resin onto the page and press the butterfly wing onto it, so that the scales stayed on the page, but the body was illustrated. So it's a really curious image. And if you go to places like the Natural History Museum, if you look through their libraries, it's stuffed full of really unusual images from around the world that hardly anyone ever gets to see. But you just have to knock on the door and make an appointment. This is a butterfly wing. It's a bicyclus, a bicycle butterfly. It's used a lot genetically because it's the equivalent to the mouse. It's very reliable. So looking at spots on the butterfly, that's a scale. That's the wing of the butterfly. So a butterfly is made up of scales like roof tiles, and as the butterfly wing is being developed in the pupa, the proteins are being switched on and off, and you get a disturbance in the middle, which is those scales crammed together. And so that's where the butterfly spot comes. And if I look at one scale, the reason why you get a lot of different forms of iridescence is the way that the light is trapped within inside each of those tiny kind of chambers. And so the disturbance there creates that spot. So it's just altering the kind of light patterns in those kind of focal areas. This is another interesting kind of artist Maria Sibylla Marian, 1700. She went around Suriname with a 10-year-old daughter, illustrating, I think she did about 90 illustrations, paintings of moths. And what's interesting is that she's talking about metamorphosis, so they're actually showing the life cycle of the plant, of the butterfly, from pupa to caterpillar to the plants that it feeds off within the one image. And that's something that became very prevalent during that time, kind of ways of trying to understand and explain and show things, but very inventive in terms of how they would construct the images. And this is a contemporary illustrator, Cornelia Hess-Honegger. She was trained as a scientific illustrator, but she got a lot of stick from the scientific illustration community because she was illustrating, this is from 3 Mile Island, so she was looking at insects that had suffered as a result of various disasters, in this case a kind of nuclear fallout. And because she's not representing a prime specimen, it was deemed not the thing to do. So another kind of prejudice in a way. So this is a small fig. And if you may not know, but a fig, it's actually an inflorescence. So it's almost like a flower inside out. So it hasn't opened up. So in there you can see those kind of red parts, which is where the pollen is. And if, like all flowers need to be pollinated by insects. So figs are pollinated by fig wasps. And this is a fig wasp, which is it'll sit on the top of a pinhead. They're very tiny. So the wasps will kind of penetrate into the fig. They'll mate. The male dies. Not much sympathy there. And the female flies out to another flower. And so I was working on this with a botanist for the fruit book. And then when I was looking kind of closer, you can see the evidence. Didn't go looking for that, but there were the kind of pollen grains on the thorax underneath. Glass is also very interesting. This is a piece by Blaschka, Leopold Rudolf Blaschka. And during the 19th century, there was a strong tradition of making scientific models in plaster and wood for teaching. They were teaching aids, but they were fantastic, actually. They were great little pieces of sculpture, some of the wooden plaster ones. And they developed glass ones. They were glass makers. But they're sensationally beautiful and skillful. There's a huge collection of plant ones that they did. I think about hundreds of them in Yale University. And they were, when they were, I think, flown out there, I'm not sure when they bought them. It was much later. And they were transported by hearse because they were the safest thing, had the best suspension for going from the airport. Because these things are so kind of delicate. They kind of they pick up any kind of vibration in a room. Glass. They have a good collection of them in the Grant Museum. Do they? Yeah. They did kind of sea creatures. I mean, we tend to have more of the kind of anemone. Yeah. And Oxford have some. They did kind of radiolaria and small things as well. So, while I was on the Nestor Fellowship, I treated myself to a 2-day course at West Dean in glass engraving. I like the idea of drawing onto glass, and again, it's phenomenally difficult to do, actually. And I was kind of looking for opportunities to explore that. And back at the Botanic Garden in Oxford, I'd been up there, and they had a problem. And the problem was that on the inside, all the glass was calcified. You couldn't see through. Oxfordshire water is pretty shit, really. I mean, it's very hard, really hard. And so kind of 40 years of water just meant it was impossible to see through. And they didn't have the money to restore it. So we applied to the Henry Moore Foundation to do a project to replace the glass, but we didn't get the funding. So but we found others. It took about 2 years, but we found other kind of sources. And looking at the glass, this was a some ice on a window, and I love the way the ice will form. It's there, it's temporary, and it goes away. So what we did, we replaced all the glass, and I etched a series of images of pollen and seeds collected from the gardens onto the glass, so that it's quite a discrete intervention. It still has condensation at different times, so they'll disappear and reappear. And you're looking again at different orders of magnification. You're seeing the same thing twice, but highly magnified. And it just transformed the space. So I think doing work in public is quite hard. It's one of my better pieces. And it's very popular with the gardens also. This is a project which was meant to happen in 2017, I think. This is a botanical school poster, turn of the century, and they were produced in Germany. And this is one of a set which is owned by the Hunt Institute, which is part of Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh. And they were found in a skip. They've been thrown out because they were thought not to be very interesting anymore. And they're just, again, there's an elegance within a kind of diagram which really appeals to me. And so we're going to try and do an exhibition using some of their images alongside some of mine. So this was my studio in Portugal. I was fortunate to go to Portugal, to the Gulbenkian Science Institute on a 3-month, which became 5-month fellowship. And I was using a different kind of microscopy. And very, very basic, just very basic light microscope, taking sections through stems of flowers, just with an ordinary kind of razor blade, about 0.5 millimeter thick. And then the coloration at this time happens at the beginning of the process. So actually that blue you can see on the table is a particular dye which they use to stain the specimens with. And different dyes will reveal different things. So there you can see the edge of a stem, and that's one single dye. And characteristically, the dye will make the epidermis, the outside